Hi, and welcome back to Neon Liberalism. This week, I want to talk about an uncomfortable subject, and that subject is the sexual abuse of children. When Donald Trump was elected for the first time in 2016, it was known that he was a bit of a sexual creep. There was the famous Access Hollywood tape where he bragged about grabbing women by the pussy. His association with Jeffrey Epstein was known at that point. And it would later come out in court that he had raped women, for instance, or sexually assaulted women. I don't really want to dwell too much on that distinction, like Jean Carroll. And somehow it never seemed to stick to him. And in particular, the QAnon movement grew up around conspiracy theories about Jeffrey Epstein running a pedophile ring that never seemed to stick to Trump, and indeed he became a figurehead of that movement. Over the last couple of weeks, however, new evidence has come out, in particular a letter that's been alleged to have written by Donald Trump to Jeffrey Epstein for his 50th birthday. And I'm going to read it out because it's disturbing, and I think it's worth dwelling on. Voiceover. There must be more to life than having everything. Donald. Yes, there is, but I won't tell you what it is. Jeffrey. Nor will I, since I also know what it is. Donald. We have certain things in common, Jeffrey. Jeffrey. Yes, we do, come to think of it. Donald. Enigmas never age. Have you noticed that? Jeffrey. As a matter of fact, it was clear to me the last time I saw you. Trump. A pal is a wonderful thing. Happy birthday, and may every day be another wonderful secret. And so this is really...
And then he signed his name as like pubes.
Oh, I didn't even hear that part. And also, I should say now, in order to talk about these issues...
Sorry.
No worries. It's great. In order to talk about these issues, I am really excited to have on Talia Lavin, who has written a great deal and studied a great deal about the reactionary right in America, and I think in particular how they relate to women and rape and children. And so I think someone who's really going to shine some light on some of the issues that have come up recently. So yeah, Talia, thanks so much for coming on the show.
Sorry to interrupt you by yelling about pubes. No, the journal's initial story said it was adorned by a sketch of a naked woman, and Trump sort of, I hate that I know what his signature looks like, but it's like he put it as like the pubes of the lady.
That's great. That's more information that I will never be able to forget now.
I feel like the last decade has just been information that I'll never be able to forget, searing itself into my brain.
I think that's very much true. And I think there's also a sense in which it's kind of not. So I recently wrote about this for our publication, Liberal Currents, an essay called We Need to Talk About Pedocon Theory. And in that essay, I argued that the relationship between Trump and Epstein, what I consider to be a very highly plausible conclusion that Donald Trump is a pedophile, isn't an accident, right? But that this emerges out of a deep feature of reactionary politics in America today. And this is because Donald Trump is hardly the first high-profile Republican pedophile. Roy Moore, you may remember him. He was the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court of Alabama and almost an American senator. The longest-serving Republican Speaker of the House, Dennis Hastert, was a pedophile. Matt Gaetz paid a 17-year-old girl for sex. The list, I could go on and on. But Trump is hardly the only one. But I think for a long time, people have not wanted to see it. And that's what I mean about facts that don't stick in the brain, that you hear over and over about these cases of rape, sexual abuse, sexual assault, pedophilia coming out of the Republican Party, but no one wants to make the association with conservative politics more generally. Does that seem right to you?
I mean, well, gosh, what's legally actionable? Let like okay. I mean, what's interesting is that the allegations about Trump ogling and fondling teenage girls, like they came out in the lead up to 2016. About around the beauty pageants, and the sort of that he would creep into the dressing room of these teenage girls, and ogle, right? Um, what is so interesting to me here is, I mean, God, it's like shit mountain, and I know too much, and it's like, yes, I think the thesis of your article is very compelling, and it certainly matches with a lot of what I've been researching, particularly for my second book, Wild Faith: How the Christian Right is Taking Over America, which talks about, which came out fairly recently, and it talks specifically about the Christian patriarchal institution of the family, and headship, by the male, etc. Um, I think when you have a situation in which absolute unquestioning male authority, um, over women and children is the only acceptable model, um, that is also a model of abuse. When obedience is considered the chief virtue in a child, that's a model of abuse. And what we're seeing across the country, where, um, educating kids about what sex is and should be, and their own desires and their own boundaries, is being so firmly squashed, that is a system that enables abuse. When we see the homeschooling movement gaining strength, gaining power, isolating children from mandatory reporters, sort of entrapping them in a home environment, that renders them more or less the property of their parents with very little regulation or almost none. That is a system that enables and primes abuse. I mean, there are so many factors here that, sort of systemically enable and encourage abuse. I think when you declare classes of people to be property and to be inherently less than, and to be, um, under the absolute power of another class of people, that is an invitation to abuse. And I think this transcends religious and secular boundaries. We see it in the tech right and the pro natalism movement, and we see it in, frankly, just the, you could argue that one of the primary driving factors of Trump's win 10 years ago, almost, was misogyny, right? And the urge to put women back in their place, so that the sexual abuse, the torrent of sexual abuse surrounding Trump and Trump's name, became part of that, became part of the system of rectifying the balance of women trying to reach beyond their place and getting too uppity. So I think, yeah, I mean, God, oof. I have to say, it makes me like more than faintly nauseated, but it's. I've spent a lot of the last couple of years really looking into abuses of children under, and women and children and teen girls, in the American context, where teen girls are so heavily sexualized, sort of unwittingly, even at such young ages, fall onto this cusp of child and woman, and, um, are so often exploited. Um,
So there's a lot in what you said, and I want to ask about all of it, but I want to start with a particular phrase you used earlier called headship, um, which I think is worth dwelling on. Um, there's a kind of mistake people make in foreign policy called mirroring, uh, where people try to understand the actions of other states or other leaders by asking themselves, well, what would I do if I was in that situation? And as a result, they tend to make a lot of mistakes because they project their own values and their own understanding of the world onto somebody who does not share those values and does not share that understanding. And I think we as liberals often make that mistake with conservatives, that we try to imagine what conservatives are like by imagining, okay, well, they're just like us, but they're different in this way or that way. And I think it's, as in foreign policy, so in domestic policy, it's important to read what people actually say themselves about what they believe and just look at what they actually do. And I know you've done a lot of research onto this subject. So, what is headship?
Yeah. Well, wait, which part of that should I address? I mean, I
So I mean,
totally,
you can say whatever you want. There's a bunch of lead up, but the question is what is headship?
yeah. I mean, first of all, I totally agree with you. I also think there's a particular blind spot about religion, where a lot of nice liberals like don't want to believe that a lot of their fellow Americans like are fully invested in a worldview in which demons and Satan and a satanic agenda that they're sort of fighting against in spiritual battle is very real, very, very real, almost tangible, right? That this is what the stakes are, for millions, tens of millions of evangelicals in the US. And we have this tendency to say, well, I'm a reasonable secular person and I couldn't possibly imagine believing that. I can't believe anyone would believe that. And then you read what evangelicals write, you talk to ex evangelicals, were some of my most valuable sources for wild faith. And no, they really do. And it's a very like insular and self reproducing system. And the idea of headship is part of it. So, um, a lot of what I've looked into is family structures. What is the ideal family structure within the Christian right? How is it? In other words, like, I mean, the other thing that's a liberal viewpoint is like everyone should have their own kind of family, right? And that's not true in the Christian right sphere. It's not true across most of the right. There is this sense of there's only one type of family structure that's acceptable, and that is the man accepts in Christian in the Christian context, it's called headship. It's absolute spiritual authority and responsibility for the family, and thus dominion over his wife, and both of them accept dominion over their children. Children here are essentially property. The wife is also property, but sort of higher grade. um, and yeah, the woman agrees to submit to the headship of her husband, and her role is rectifying his sin and in sort of embracing even his faults, even if like when you read these Christian marriage manuals, it's this idea of like your role is to accept submission, even if you know there are things you could do better than your husband. Part of your role in becoming a truly godly woman is simply allowing him to um, take over, even and reject your own authority. I mean, at its most extreme, it's essentially a kind of self mortification or even a dissociation. It's like a removal of the self from the self. And this is just like reading like how to be a Christian wife kind of books. It's like not I didn't have to go far. I was like looking on Amazon at like the most popular Christian marriage manuals, and they're like die to yourself. Like I mean, it's really intense. So submitting to headship is really this vision of the family of like absolute masculine authority. And as I said earlier, I mean, this is like condition that's so ripe for abuses of all kinds. Whether we're talking about um, sort of doctrinally mandated physical abuse of children under the guise of discipline and instilling obedience, um, or the sort of natural extension of that, which is, well, my child is my property and my child's body is my property. And chastisement and physical chastisement are part of my world. And authority is always to be respected. I mean, look at that and tell me that isn't a system of abuse of all
I
kinds.
mean, I'm not going to tell you that. And I think it's interesting to dwell on this, like what you talked about, the death of the self, that like the kind of obedience that they're talking about here, you should obey even when you know it's wrong, right? You should obey even when or even not know is a strong word, even when you think it's wrong or you think it's sinful, but they have rightful authority and you should just let go of your own judgment and submit to that authority. Is that what we're talking about here?
Sinful is complicated because it's like, can you be sinning if you are submitting and that's your allotted role? I mean, like, I'm not talking about like, I don't know, abetting adultery or whatever. It's like, even if you, for example, think that you would be more competent at managing the household's finances, your husband doesn't want you to, like, submitting and giving up responsibility is part of your godly role. And so that can't be sinful. These systems are internally consistent, even if they're sort of outwardly, they outwardly might be considered sort of horrifying. So there isn't the sense of like, if your husband's sinning, enable him to sin. It's more like, present him with forgiveness. Always be forgiving. Forgive him, pray for him, never abandon him, never get divorced. That's what it says about if your husband is sinning. And your sin is rebellion. Your sin is coldness. Your sin is not always always smiling and being available. And as for children, one of the things that's really at the core of all of this, and why I sort of chose to write a book about the Christian right in the way I did, one of the first books I encountered on this subject was a very, very famous book called The Strong-Willed Child by James Dobson, who sort of went on to become a super lobbyist for the Christian right, an immensely powerful figure. But he was trained as a child psychologist, and his initial rise to fame was and the reason he was able to start Focus on the Family, which is very powerful, remains a powerful ministry, but was sort of at its peak in the 80s and 90s, is because he wrote these child rearing books, Dare to Discipline and The Strong-Willed Child. And one thing that's not immediately obvious if you're not in this milieu, and certainly wasn't obvious to me coming from an entirely different, first of all, religion, but also, just mindset, is that the strong-willed child is a bad thing. Like, the goal of the book is to eliminate the child's strong will. And the child's strong will is something to be conquered and broken. Now, when I think of the children in my life and their curiosity and their stubbornness and their occasional intractability, I find that kind of beautiful in its way. Yes, frustrating sometimes. That's how children figure out the world, right? But there are a lot of but I just, like, one of the most heartbreaking things I heard in a lot of conversations with ex-evangelicals who were raised with these parenting doctrines was just this. One woman said to me, I don't know what made me so strong-willed, but I fucking want it back, right? And so Dobson was largely reacting, when he wrote these books in the 70s, to a decade of youth-led student protest movement. movements that were pushing for gay rights, that were pushing for women's rights, and particularly civil rights. Right, opposition to civil rights is at the core of the Christian right, why it became such a political power. Essentially, segregated Christian schooling as an alternative to federally integrated public schooling is what sort of woke the sleeping giant of the Christian right. So, and I never want to neglect the sort of racism angle because it's so central to the Christian right becoming the powerhouse it is today. But I think also Dobson was reacting to the fact that these movements were led by students and by youth. So it's not a coincidence that the 70s saw the rise of the so-called biblical parenting movement, the sort of spare the rod, right, spoil the child kind of view. And Dobson lays out a very punitive but also very regimented approach to physically abusing children from a very young age, from 15 months onward, in his case, and earlier in other cases. I mean, we're talking crawling kids that you smack, you hit. And, this image of the father wielding the rod, right? The father disciplining the child is something that is remarkably, if you start looking for it, if you start noticing it, it's incredibly present in conservative imagery, especially around Trump. Like, you had Tucker Carlson and Mel Gibson, and recently Jesse Waters sort of comparing Trump to a father who was taking off his belt to punish America and to chastise America back into its rightful place. And that's the sort of central image here of the father coming to restore patriarchal order. And then you also have Trump as this figure who has engaged in sexual abuse of women for decades, unpunished, across, and certainly women who are young and powerless. And that stuff we've known. We didn't need secret files to know that. We don't need secret files to know that. These women have come forward and said so, That's part of what breaks my heart about this whole thing is like, America doesn't give a shit about the pain of teen girls. America is busy rendering teen girls' lives perilous and terrifying and taking away whatever power they've ever had. The lure of the Epstein scandal is that there are always secrets, right? Like in QAnon, it's like what is known is worthless, right? The lure of a conspiracy is the idea of secret knowledge. That secret knowledge makes you part of the elect, right? That you can spot the patterns, etc.
Yeah, I mean, I basically agree with that, that it is depressing that it's taken this moment for anything of this whole cloud of awful things that he's done to start sticking to Trump. I'm also willing to ride the moment, and to try and use it as an opportunity to talk about some of this other stuff that, like you say, has been out in the open for a long time. Right, this stuff that you've been talking about in terms of like the discipline of children and the concept of headship, like this isn't none of that secret. These are books that you can find on Amazon, right? These are like if you go looking, like I want to learn what Christian marriage is, you can find that on Amazon and they'll just mail it to you. And one thing I think is interesting to try and connect this to some of the larger political issues we're seeing today in terms of children, and the panic among conservatives about trans kids and about queer kids generally, right? This sense that like my children are my property and they're supposed to turn out exactly the way I want them to turn out. And like society is potentially corrupting them or turning them queer, turning them trans, or turning them liberal. And we need to like reassert the boundaries of the patriarchal family to bring children back under the ownership of the father. Does that seem right to you? Do these seem like issues that are connected?
Of course. Yeah. I mean, parental rights as a movement, right? This is something that's been brooded around, and it's part of the rationale for people, for the school board shenanigans and the book bans, right? This idea of the parental right over the child, and the converse, that children have rights, that children have certain rights, is just not something that comes up. Um, you know, One thing that struck me and that I found out when researching the book is that the US is the only country in the UN not to have signed the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child. Um, the only country. I think South Sudan was a holdout until recently, and then they signed. And it's just us. It's just us, and that's across, you know, liberal presidents and conservative presidents alike. There have been a lot of like preemptive sallies in Congress to kind of prevent the Convention on the Rights of the Child from like being signed or enforced in any way. It's sort of a bugbear in conservative circles. If you go to like parentalrights.org, which is a fundamentalist Christian site, they have a whole like spiel about how evil the UNCRC is. What the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child is, it arose after World War II, when there was a child refugee crisis. You had millions of stateless children, millions of children who were imperiled. It was initially a very basic document of just like a child should have a name, a child should have food, a child should have a home, and it's evolved to stuff like children should not be in like solitary confinement in juveniles should not be in solitary confinement unless absolutely necessary. I mean, none of it is particularly um, outrageous. It's a child should have an education, a child should have a name, a child should not be stateless, right? And yet, nonetheless, it's become this sort of bugbear on the right, and it's something that multiple at this point, many presidencies have simply chosen not to touch. I think there's an element of American sort of libertarianism of like, I have the right to raise my child however I want. That's totally secular, that rebels against this. There's also certainly, it is kind of in right wing circles. It's like, this is the one world government, kind of interfering with our children, blah blah blah. But what the document actually lays out, if you look at it, is it's uncompromising, but also very reasonable idea that children have certain inalienable rights to protection and to support. And that is just not like simply not an idea that exists in American culture. And in the absence of that idea and that framework, and as the idea of conversely parental rights gains steam, you have a system that inherently just enables abuse.
So I want to kind of ask something that we've been hinting a little bit here and there in our conversation, but we've talked a bit about the conception of the family, the conception of spiritual patriarchal authority that's present in evangelical religion, specifically in how they talk about child discipline and fatherly authority and so forth. But Donald Trump's not an evangelical, right? Donald Trump doesn't come from that background. Other, notoriously kind of rapey rapists on the right, like Andrew Tate, right? He's not selling evangelical philosophy or evangelical theology to his followers. He's like a pimp who like ran cam girls and like a scheme of sexual exploitation. Um, and so I guess that's my question for you. How much of this explicitly evangelical conception of family, how much of that is shared with other elements of the right today?
I mean, I think this is something that I like if I had published my book a couple of months later, right? And my book came out right before the election, the presidential election, and one thing that initially surprised me was that the sort of most visible prominent figures were not the Christian right, that had sort of achieved the apogee of its power. I would argue that they're sort of underpinning um, not just the base, but also a lot of the people that make up the sort of figureheads of power. But the people that you saw most prominently were like Elon Musk and like Doge and the sort of tech right. And of course Tate is a pure misogynist, and that's what he sells, right? Um, I would argue there are a lot of different ways to approach an idea or a bias. And what we see here is convergent evolution. There are a lot of different ways to approach the idea that society should be a hierarchy with men, and particularly white men, on top. And what we see here is not a seamless coalition, certainly, but a coalition that essentially agrees on what the place of women and children should be, which is under authority and submissive, right? I would argue that the attacks on trans kids, that the attacks on abortion rights, these are primarily religiously motivated, or at least a sop to the religious element um, of Trump's coalition. I would also, yes, Trump is not an evangelical. He's not. He doesn't um, present himself as such, but he's also been in a working coalition with them for like 10 years. And one thing that a lot of liberals missed was the religious significance of the assassination attempt on Trump during his campaign in Butler, Pennsylvania. You know, from that point on, first of all, there was a lot of iconography around it, this sort of fight, 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 the bloody ear, and so on. But from then on, and at the RNC, and ongoing, and up to the present day, Trump has described himself as spared by the intervention of God to lead the country, and has been described as such by others, particularly on the Christian right. So there was always the sense, and it was stated as such, that Trump is God's tool, and God has unlikely tools, and so on. That Trump was he was often compared to Cyrus, the emperor of Persia, who was a heathen, but nonetheless allowed the Second Temple to be built. This idea that God chooses flawed vessels, and this was how initially the sort of Access Hollywood crudity got like absorbed into the like Mike Pence stuff of the world, like how evangelicals were able to vote for someone who so unabashedly embraced sexual immorality. I don't think the consent or lack thereof was even like relevant, really. One thing that's so striking if you read about sin in books by evangelicals and for evangelicals is that it's all sexual sin. And sin is sort of flattened and equal. And so that like a non-consensual sexual act is like no more or less of a sin than a consensual one. Like it's all sexual immorality. And that kind of flattening effect, I think, renders um, rape and abuse on the same level as just like sex. And yeah, which is horrifying in and of itself.
I mean, not Bill O'Reilly. The Rush. I think it's Rush Limbaugh had this line from a while back about how liberals believe in this magical thing called consent, and if people consent, then the act's okay. But if they don't consent, then it's not. It's like obviously this is nonsense. It doesn't matter whether you consent. It matters what you're doing. And I think like that's kind of the key to a lot of how they think about this stuff. That it's a question of like you say, does it fit with the hierarchy? Does it, does it accord with authority? It doesn't matter what the people involved think about it. It matters whether this is like in accordance with the hierarchy that they believe in or not. um,
Yeah, exactly. I mean, consensuality is irrelevant. What's relevant is the act, and thereby hides a myriad of abuses, right? So that some of the people I talked to were rape victims who were rendered, when I was talking about purity culture, right? You had these like purity culture influencers who talked about how to repent for the sin of not fighting back hard enough. Um, the I spoke to a rape victim who was made to feel so ashamed of her uh, rapes that of what had happened to her, that she wound up marrying the man who raped her. This is it's deeply disturbing. Uh, it's also super widespread. Um, and that's without bringing in like the idea of sort of inherent inability to consent because of power disparity, like when we're talking about 15-year-old girls and business titans and whatever, like when we're talking about situational inability to consent. I mean, America as a whole, even outside these religious enclaves, is also a deeply misogynistic society, so that it does become difficult to disentangle, and it's not an illegitimate question. It's like, at what point does religious misogyny stop and plain old misogyny begin? And I would again argue like in favor of convergent evolution, sort of people working towards the same goal, two oxes in harness, and so forth. I'd also say
yeah,
this is a Christian country. Like,
that's
liberal Christians really like to deny this. They're like, there's a separation between church and state. I'm like, really? As someone who's never belonged to a church, let me tell you, I don't think that's true. Like, I don't think that's true at all. And I don't think anyone who lives in like Alabama or Iowa or any of the many states in which Christianity is explicitly cited as the reason for legislation would necessarily stand and argue that, oh, there is a separation of church and state, that it's somehow inviolable. I think that that firewall has been gone for a long time and it's just more open now. But elements of Christian morality suffuse every element of American society, and that includes patriarchy, women's worth, relative worth, children's role, etc., etc.
no, I think that's quite right. And the point about convergent evolution, I think is worth dwelling on. And you talked earlier about how Mel Gibson and other people are using these like daddy's home metaphors about Donald Trump, and the way that the kind of authoritarian politics within the family is kind of mirrored both on like a structural but also like an affective, emotional level with the kind of authoritarian politics that they're trying to enact, on a national level or on a public level. And what I think is interesting is how these structures, right, these same basic themes where you have, okay, we have an authoritarian father figure, we have a woman whose job it is to submit to that father figure and produce children. You can put a lot of different religious wallpapers on that same basic structure, but the structure is pretty consistent. Right, which is why we've seen the same kinds of sex abuse scandals in, the Southern Baptist Church, as in the Church of Latter-day Saints, as in the Catholic Church, because they have similar structures that enable abuse and that enable these pretty ideologically different people to cooperate in a kind of an authoritarian political project. That's not really a question, but
Yeah, one term that I heard coined in like a anti-abortion screed in the 80s that I read was a term called co-belligerency, where different sects of Christianity would sort of overcome their natural proclivity to, I don't know, like have a Reformation war or whatever, and like accept common cause, fight for one another. Like the abortion in particular was a Catholic issue for many, many years, up to the mid 70s, up to and including after the passage of Roe versus Wade. Abortion was not a Protestant cause. And what essentially happened was that there were a lot of savvy, well placed, hard right Catholics like Paul Weyrich and Phyllis Schlafly who were trying to build a religious right from whole cloth. And what they essentially did was form a pact with these sort of newly awakened white Southern Protestants that were becoming politically active in the wake of Brown versus Board of Education, and particularly also court rulings that took away tax exemptions from segregated religious schools, going after Bob Jones University and so on. And they said, look, guys, like, there's a civil rights movement, segregation now, segregation forever, lost. It's not sympathetic. You should adopt another cause. And you can be fighting for the civil rights of the unborn. And so from a very early era, right in the 70s, the language of civil rights was adopted by people who were fighting against abortion access. So you see, like talking about people who are anti-abortion as abolitionists, people talking about the civil rights of the unborn. And that framework has very successfully been carried forward 50 years and is still being used. This idea of rights for, like, it is fascinating and ironic given how much child abuse and many kinds and cruelty towards children I have documented and seen, that the framing of the anti-abortion movement is all about the rights of the unborn child. But but it also kind of makes sense. Like, the unborn child is ideal. The unborn child can't disobey. The unborn child is perfectly obedient. And so, like, of course you would lavish attention, affection, and rights on someone who can never defy you, right? Inherently. Whereas the woman, who's the vessel of the child, becomes an irrelevancy, or better yet, something to be squashed.
So I want to ask a last question on this particular topic, and that's, why is it pedophilia? Why kids, right? We've talked about these kinds of social structures that enable abuse, right? That this culture of obedience, this culture of authority, this culture of submission. But why do these guys wind up sexually abusing kids over and over? Was there something that drives them to it? Either like in their culture, in their ideology, or is it just like, oh, well, the structures enable abuse, and so you wind up with abusers in them?
I think the question answers itself to a degree. Like when you have entire systems primed for, let's say, one sort of abuse, say, like set up around the physical abuse of children, right? Set up around the idea that children are property, not entitled to education, not entitled to protection of any kind. You create opportunity. Um, and when you create a system in which men are primed for um, total authority and to treat disobedience as a direct challenge, um, there's then an attraction to people who are malleable to power, right? People who are powerless. Um, and the figure of the wife, the woman, is yes, she is submissive. Yes, she is less powerful, but she's also a co-enforcer of patriarchal authority in this family system. Many people that I spoke to described being abused by their mothers, right? Um, whereas the child is the recipient of abuse, period, right? So, I would say opportunity. This is like a system ripe for opportunity, and sometimes opportunity creates abuse, molds abusers, maybe. Where I remember I have a chapter in my book about Christian manhood, and I spoke to a very reflective guy who had sort of come out of evangelicalism and said, like, I was molded to be a petty tyrant, right? That was what I was raised to be. And when you raise someone to be a petty tyrant, petty tyranny is what you get. When you create, at this point, it's been 50 years of the biblical parenting movement, right? And whatever secular echoes come from that. But, the Christian right also just like has a lot of power in and of itself. It is a very influential movement. And a lot of what I was looking at were intergenerational cycles of abuse and trauma, and just like how these systems perpetuate themselves. In order to break away from a system of abusing kids, of breaking the will of your child, right? Um, you have to recognize that what was done to you was wrong. You have to make that jarring shift in your own identity and break away from these very tight knit, very self surveilling communities, um, with all the sacrifices that entails. And most people are not necessarily willing or able to make that split in their identities. I myself left a fundamentalist religion, and it was very painful. It was very difficult, and it left me a lot lonelier and with less of a community than I would have had otherwise. Um, Not Christian, but so this is asking a lot of people. But your
It,
cat has opinions.
the cat has opinions. The cat is against all of this bullshit. He's
Yeah, God, I feel awful talking about it, to be honest. Um, this is the
not a cheery
problem.
subject.
This is the problem with like handling disturbing material. My first book was about neo Nazis, so it's like I'm used to like talking about like evil speak, and it's just like so much of your bells. But yeah, I mean,
I mean,
like,
I think that's important, right? In these times, to like not look away from it. To like, whatever. I don't mean this on a practical level. I'm not saying people need to go seek out lurid stories, but just to like face up to what the people on the other side believe in, what they're trying to do, what they have done.
I
And I
mean, I think
guess
for me with the Epstein stuff, it's like it's such an ambiguous position that I find myself in, just as someone who's been focused on, like, razor focused on the abuse of children and the abuse of women in the right wing context for years now. Um, like, of course, I want shit to stick to Donald Trump. I also don't want us to lose sight of the fact that, like, what is at the heart of this is that many, many, many children were abused. Um, Harm was caused, pain was caused, that children were treated like objects for the sexual pleasure of powerful men. And that's what stands at the center here. Not like a juicy file, not like a bit of gossip. And yet, I don't want to be the killjoy and like the wet blanket and like say, stop enjoying this because, you know, um, I want the fucker to, suffer a consequence for once in his goddamn life. But I would like us not to forget that we are standing on the harm of children here. That that's what's at the core, and that's what should be like. That's to me that's what drives my anger, and also I become a little resentful of how sort of blithe people are and jokey people can get about the situation, just because.
No, what we're talking about are genuinely horrific crimes with real people who were victims of it, and far beyond Donald Trump, who continue to be victims of these kinds of patriarchal cultures, right? This is happening right now out there somewhere in America.
Like
And so
everywhere in America, in your town, right?
I I believe it absolutely. I have no question about that.
Yeah, and that's why QAnon is so fixated on stranger danger too. Like, this
Yes,
idea
it's
that you're
not a
going to be,
stranger, it's the menu now.
yeah, it's the father, it's the pastor, it's like the figures of authority in your life, and we know this. We've known this for decades. That's why, like, people who actually, help trafficking victims and child abuse survivors are like, "What the fuck are you talking about?" Like, this is not how child abuse works. This like lurid fantasy. I mean, I could talk for hours about how messed up and just like how like the origins of QAnon, the like blood libelish nature of it, all of it. I mean, there's so much there to unpack, but like frankly, if I keep talking about the sexual abuse of children, I might cry. So maybe
So,
I'm in the wrong line of work.
and yet here we are.
Yeah.
So
Um yeah.
my last question. We're coming up on the end of time here, and so maybe instead of asking you to unpack QAnon, I mean, I'm sure it would be a fascinating conversation. But I guess what I want to ask you is, what can we do? What do you think we should do today, tomorrow, going forward to try and combat this culture of child abuse that we're talking about?
My books are more descriptive than proscriptive. I think for
I mean,
me,
this is I was going to say this is just something I asked all my guests to do, is to really just swing for the fences here, right? To like imagine something big, or not, whatever. You can imagine whatever you want, but to like really try and imagine a better world where we are fighting back against this stuff.
yeah, I mean, first of all, I would say knowing your enemy and like knowing, like not mirroring, like you said earlier, like knowing where they're coming from. And I don't blame anyone for not knowing off the bat because most evangelical literature and movies and TV and all of it is insular. It's by and for evangelicals, and there's no reason you should have heard of it necessarily. It's not for you, right? But it is there. Um, and the aim certainly of my book was just to be like, what's going on? Why? What motivates these people, right? And I think more of that is good. Not out of sympathy, but just because you can better combat people if you understand what drives them, right? But if I had to talk about like what I would like to see, I would like to see a children's rights movement emerge in the United States. not in like a NAMBLA kind of way, like, which is horrifying, right? And uses the language of rights in this deeply twisted way. But like, if you like take a second and like read the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child, especially like the early version, like we should embrace the idea that irrespective of the wishes of parents, whether they're sovereign citizens or hippies or whatever, a child should have a name. A child should have a social security number. A child should be safe from harm, physical harm. A child should have an education. A child should uh, not be subjected uh, to physical cruelty. That children, living, complicated, messy, frustrating kids, have rights and deserve our protection. Um, there are a lot of people, who have embraced child liberation theology. There are children's rights advocates. I would like to see it become as urgent and as mainstream as any other rights movement in the US. Because if we start with the idea that children are property to be degraded, to be abused, to be deprived of education, to be deprived, in some cases, of, you know, uh, documentation, vaccination, all the things they need, right? If the least of us are not protected, then what are we doing?
No, I mean, I like, again, speaking as a trans person, I absolutely agree with this, right? In terms of, like, again, just to connect with it on a personal level, the kind of attacks we're seeing on trans kids, right? The kind of denial of their own ability to be who they are, to make their own
And
choices about their
self-define.
lives, to, yes, to control their own bodies, to self-define, to, like, this is the thing about kids, is they grow up and become adults, and like the adult just gets to live their own life, right? They ought to be anyways a free and equal member of society, and we need to recognize that that's where kids are going, and they need some of those same protections. Um,
Right. And you know, beating obedience into a child so that they will become an obedient and pliant adult, that has a goal, right?
that has a goal.
It is hard to uh argue that like the cacophony of like children's joy should be something that we militate for as hard, because it's a little more diffuse. But for me, it's really become central and passionate, and I think absolutely the arrogance and the cruelty and the viciousness of these attacks on the bodily autonomy of trans children, on the sort of um, denial of them, of trans kids as sort of moral beings, as beings with their own intellect, is part and parcel of the child as property kind of argument, that a parent's desire should override the desire of a child about their own body, right? um Even in the sort of the liminal space of teenage dumb, right, that you're your parents property up until you turn 18, right? I don't think there's any class of people in the United States that should be defined as property, um uh at all. And with all the resonances that has. So what I would like to see is, yes, a child's rights movement that it sounds outre, right? It's not within our sphere to argue that, you know. But children have rights to protection. Children have rights to autonomy. Children have rights not to have their wills broken with a birch switch, I think, or should. We should fight for that because because otherwise we'll just be trapped in more and more generational authoritarian trauma. Otherwise, it'll never end. That's what I think.
No, I think that's right, and I think in these times after recent events, recent disasters, we do have to start thinking about what kind of a future we want to be fighting for. That we can't just say, oh, we're going to do the same but ever so slightly different. I think we need more than technocratic tinkering around the edges, but a real reimagining of what America and life in America can be if we're willing and able to fight for it. So thank you so much for coming on the podcast, for talking about some of these pretty tough, pretty dark issues. It was a pleasure having you on. And yeah, thanks again.
Yeah, no, I've been trying to write about the Epstein stuff for weeks and keep getting like too like entangled in my own whatever, like how the horror of it. And so I appreciate the chance to talk some of it out. And I think, yeah, and if anyone is interested in seeing these ideas as I kind of encountered them and elaborated on them, the book I wrote about the Christian right is called Wild Faith, how the Christian right is taking over America. And I also have a newsletter called The Sword and the Sandwich. It comes out a couple times a week, where I talk about politics and also do some food writing and culture writing that's a little less, I don't know, soul murdering than this stuff.
Working your way through the great sandwiches of the world.
Yeah, well, Wikipedia's list of notable sandwiches. I've written 130 essays about sandwiches, and my next book is about sandwiches because you cannot spend your entire life pressed up against like the glass of evil. I have spent the last 10 years like staring more or less straight into the abyss, and I'm still doing it. For sure. I'm still keeping my queer shoulder to the wheel, as Allen Ginsberg says, but we all have to have respite and healing, and I couldn't. I needed a break. I needed to write a book that wasn't about something that made me want to throw myself off a roof. But yeah. Anyway, sorry for that digression. Uh,
No, no, I think it's important, like you say, to find a little joy in the world. Um, so yeah, on that note, thanks again for coming on, and I'm sure I'll see you around.